Welcome, Megalithomaniacs. We're back online with Andrew Collins. Today, we're talking in the Megalithomania video podcast, which also goes out on the Megalithomania YouTube channel, about Karahan Tepe. Now, Megalithomania produced a video about that. Andrew's got one out. He's got another one. And there's some revelations coming out with that site now. Now it's been exposed. Now it's been opened up. We can see what's going on there, and the analysis that Andrew's done with Rodney Hale is quite remarkable, and there's more. It just keeps happening. So this is just the start of trying to understand this remarkable site, which is really, it's known as the sister site to Gobekli Tepe, if people aren't aware. It's in the Tek Mountains area of Sanliurfa province in southeast Turkey, or Anatolia. And Andrew's been going there since 2004 to Karahan Tepe and Gobekli Tepe. I've been going to Carahan and Gobekli since 2013. Been there 3 times with Andrew and JJ in our groups that we take out there, and it was always unexcavated, covered over, so we only saw the tips of these pillars coming out of the top, amongst other things like the unfinished monolith, which fascinates me. So we're going to get into that today, but also we're going to be running the Origins Conference on the 6th of November 2021. Online conference, runs from 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. on the 6th of November. Andrew's going to be speaking there, and he's going to be presenting his cutting edge research on Karahan Tepe and sites in that area, as well as we have JJ is going to be looking at JJ Ainsworth is going to be looking at the symbolic aspects of those sites and what's being discovered relating to other sites around the world. Myself and Jim Vieira are going to be launching our book, The Giants of Stonehenge and Ancient Britain, at the conference, and talking about different aspects of the book. We have Scott Creighton as well, who's going to be looking at the Great Pyramid Void Enigma. And of course, Greg Little is going to be joining us from America, looking at the stellar alignments of mound culture sites and his new discoveries there. So we've got quite a lot lined up. So do check out the Megalithomania website, also originsconference.co.uk. And also Andrew's website is andrewcollins.com, so you can check out what he's up to. And welcome, Andrew. Thanks for joining us on here again.
Yeah, pleased to be here. I mean, at the moment, I just want to talk about Carahan and everything that's going on there. I mean, it's obsessed me over the past few weeks since the main announcements have come out, and we're making incredible strides of discovery relating it. And let's hope we can talk about some of those as we go along today.
That's right. I mean, the big announcement came out at the end of September. There was like a public kind of governmental level kind of opening of the site. It's not open to the public yet. That's going to be opening in the spring, summer next year. But I got excited by it when I saw what was going on there. Graham Hancock revealed he'd been there as well, and all the photos and some of the incredible things at that site that are completely unique. It's quite different to Gobekli Tepe in many ways. And let's just describe it a little bit, Andrew. I mean, one of the things that kind of got me was the whole the fact you have the large enclosure, which appears to be larger than any enclosure at Gobekli Tepe, and then you've got this sunken kind of carved out of solid bedrock area with these 11 pillars in. They're the two things that really got me. The fact that you've got those benches around that side with almost like the pillars are carved out of the bedrock on one side of the larger enclosure, which is like 75 feet wide. I think it's actually larger than enclosure D at Gobekli Tepe. So maybe you could just, although we've kind of covered this in the video I produced and you produced, just explain what's going on there, what we can see now.
Well, let's explain what it was like beforehand. Before all the excavations, it was just this rocky limestone hill. And you could see, as you've mentioned, these, tops of T-shaped pillars coming out of the ground. A few of them had been investigated by Bahattin Shelek of Iran University. He found some interesting artifacts and took away at least one of the pillars that were looked at in these little test pits. It was a remote region. I mean, it was really difficult to try and get there. The first time I ever went there, and obviously, as you mentioned, we've been there several times, and we've done plenty of work, come up with some good ideas relating to it, and they're online, as you know. I've done some articles. But then in 2019, excavations began there for the first time under the leadership of Neshmi Karul of Istanbul University. And they did, ground penetration radar surveys first to see the best possible places to look, and started to dig in what they describe as the northern part of the Western Terrace. Now, when I say Western, it means the eastern side of the top of the hill, which is essentially north-south running. And they dug down there and cut through various small enclosures. I mean, tiny bathroom-sized ones with tiny little stones, and cut down to the bedrock, where they found 3 and plus 1, so underground structures. When I say underground, I mean subterranean. In other words, cut actually into the bedrock. And the largest of these is a huge ellipse that, as you mentioned, one side of it is actually cut into the bedrock on the western face, on the western side. And this has got 3 or 4 huge, great, what I call thrones, stone thrones, which you quite clearly would have sat on. And each one is divided by what they're describing as buttresses, stone buttresses, which are, again, carved out of the bedrock. And this is unique. There's nothing like this, for this time frame at all. And then the rest of the enclosure is dropped down into the bedrock, completely smoothed off. And around the outside are stone walls, which would have had a series of T-pillars in. And there were 2 larger T-pillars roughly in the centre, although that's an enigma which we can perhaps talk about, which they have discovered, but they're broken. They've obviously fallen, smashed, and they're still in situ. They've obviously gathered up the pieces of them and just recreated them to a degree where they've fallen, just so they know exactly what's going on. So this is the big enclosure, what I call the elliptical enclosure. And this is actually known as enclosure or structure AD. And that's what Carahan has called it. But this is linked on its northwestern side through a hole, a stone hole that's 70 centimetres in diameter, that you virtually have to crawl through to get into another deep structure that has 10 standing stones that are carved out of the bedrock, which are described as phallic in appearance, and certainly you could say that was the case. But with an 11th megalith or standing stone in it that's actually been done separately and put into a slot right in the middle of the enclosure at the back so that it faces towards you. And that's curved. And it's unquestionably, in my opinion, animistic, in the sense that it's meant to be a creature looking at you. What exactly it is, we don't know. It could be a crocodile, but more likely it is a snake.
Is that freestanding, that one, or is that?
Yes, it is. That's freestanding.
So that's like sitting in a small sort of little pod at the bottom. It's sort of like
little pit or slot. Yeah. Then on the wall on the western side is a incredibly weird carved head with a very distinguished mouth and features, and it's on a long neck. And in my opinion, that is serpentine. That is a human-headed serpent, no question at all. And as you crawl into this, and I say I have not been there. As I say, our colleague Graham Hancock has, and I know Hugh and JJ hope to get out there as soon as we possibly can. But when you crawl down into this second chamber, which I call the Pillars Shrine, that's just what I'm calling it. Its official name is Structure AB. You're down in there and you've got the pillars around you. You've got this weird carved head, and you really wouldn't be able to do much in there. I think in size, it's 6 by 7 meters, although we'll confirm that. But you wouldn't be able to do much in there. It's a very strange, clearly functional ritual place. You're not going to be dancing around in there. If you're going to go in there, you're going in there for a specific purpose. But then there is another deep structure beyond that seems to have access via very rough cut stairs at the end of it. And this is what I call the pit shrine. And it's a sort of weird elliptical shaped structure, perhaps just a little larger than the one you've just been in. And it has a bench on the western side. And along the bench is this incredible carved snake. There is also a fox with it as well. And actually in the floor, there's a deep pit sunken down. I don't know how far it goes down. It looks like it goes down at least 1.5 meters, basically. And these three different structures, by the way, this third one is structure AA. They're all, numbered, if you want, or named based on the discovery of, which order, is that they're all interconnected. And they're clearly all part of some kind of ritual process or practice. And I would say that everything at the moment is indicating that this is serpentine or snake-like in nature. But we'll come back to that, because I think that relates to the cosmology of what's going on here. But as far as the actual geometry, the alignments, the placements of these structures, the ellipse, which I think is 23 meters in length, is actually fits perfectly into a ellipse that has a ratio of either 6:5 or 32:27. Now that sounds like a very odd ratio, but it's not. It appears in Pythagorean musical tradition as representing the minor third, one of the intervals, the mixing together of two notes to create a third note or tone, a so-called interval. Now that could be coincidence. I mean, we obviously don't know exactly what was behind their motivation of design of these structures, but it's there. I mean, whether it's by accident or design, it's there. And what that does is if you fit that nicely into the elliptic enclosure, it gives you a perfect axis. And that axis is around 10 degrees east of north, with a cross axis, obviously, of around 10 degrees south of east. And that seems to be, there. I mean, all right, it might be a degree out or whatever. We're obviously basing it on what little published material that we've got. But there seems to be other alignments connected with this. For instance, there seems to be a line from what I call the southern entrance of this ellipse, which is between two huge posts with what appears to be, quite clearly an entrance point into it, towards the pillar shrine and through the pillar shrine. And that has an axis that, if you followed it, takes you directly to another hill, only a couple of miles away, to the northwest, which is called Gobekli Tepe. Gobekli is the name of the farm. And the interesting thing about this hill, this northern hill, which Hugh knows well, we've investigated it together, is that it has caves in it, two very large caves and one smaller cave. And these show evidence of having been fashioned or carved out in some form. And also on top of it, there is what we call the rock temple, which is cut into the bedrock, a rectilinear structure, which we investigated, photographed and filmed, which I unquestionably believe is pre-pottery and Neolithic in age. There is also other little features up there, and there is stone tools suggesting the presence of pre-pottery and Neolithic peoples up there. So there's no question that it formed part of some kind of ceremonial landscape, and that the two hills, Karahan Tepe to the south, Gobekli Tepe to the north, have some kind of dual relationship with each other. So that's that. But what's so interesting is that we'd already worked out years ago that there is a very specific astronomical alignment from the knoll, the rocky knoll that's immediately above these three subterranean structures, which we call the Northern Knoll, that if you stood on that around 9000 BC, you would have seen the bright star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus, the celestial bird, swan in Europe, or also known as the Northern Cross, setting down into that hill very specifically. And I'd noticed that years ago, but the alignment between the elliptical enclosure and the pillar shrine matches that alignment perfectly, which brings us into what are these pillars inside this shrine. They're described as phallic in nature, and certainly they are. I mean, they are like cylinders, but with a larger blob on the top. So you can easily say that they are phallic, but are they phalluses or phalli, I should say? I think maybe, but I think that they are also going to be representative of intelligence, maybe entities. And I would say that they probably represent the ancestors myself. I think that the larger heads that they've got are making them anthropomorphic in nature. I think they represent the ancestors, and I think that what it's telling us, this alignment, is that Gobekli Tepe is the place of the ancestors, or a place of emergence, just like the so-called Sipapu of Native American tradition, which you find in the Hopi, amongst the Hopi tribes, the Zunis, and I think probably others as well, have this idea of a sacred hill with some kind of hole in it that humanity come out of symbolically into this world. And I think that's what Gobekli Tepe represents. And I think that it formed a very strong part of the rituals that were going on. But that's nothing compared with with the rest of what's going on there. I mean, firstly, they've already discovered about 250 T-shaped pillars. I mean, that's an incredible amount. There are at least another dozen or so smaller enclosures that they've uncovered, including another one, which is structure AC, which is also cut into the bedrock, which don't know much about. They're still investigating that. But that's a little to the east of these other ones we've been talking about, and to the north of the ellipse itself. But let's not worry about that. We don't know much about that at the moment. And I mean, excavations are still taking place there now, in a way which they're not at Gobekli. I mean, Gobekli has slowed down dramatically in what's happening at that site. But it would seem that with a different team involved at Carahan, one that's from Istanbul University, they seem to really want to get answers, and I applaud them for that, because this has given us incredible information very quickly. And to be honest, my own information is updating almost daily. I mean, only in the last couple of days, I've read the first paper that's come out by Neshmi Carol, which I think hopefully Hugh will put a link to so that people can actually read that. It's only about it's only a very basic introduction to the main structures, and it more is about their burial, because that's the other important thing, is that there was very deliberate burial of these structures. And I mean, not just, chuck a whole load of stuff on top. Different layers would seem to have been built up. And with the pillar shrine, they actually put large blocks of stone on each of these bedrock pillars to extend the height of the shrine itself, so that when they put the filling in very, very carefully in different layers, they would know exactly where it was. They could tell where that structure was forever. They deliberately buried it. And according to Neshmi Carroll himself, he believes that all of this was not just because of the fact that they were decommissioning what was going on there, but that it was part of the experience, that everything had gone on there, and that its burial formed part of the process of the end of its life. and even beyond that, to know where it was, so you could still do rituals where it was located. So I think that's the basis at the moment, but there's more that we can unpack as we go along.
Well, it's also with that that kind of where the monoliths are in that small pit. There's one thing I noticed. I mentioned this to Graham Hancock. I emailed him about this because there's clearly a water channel that leads into it, and he said that the archaeologist there had actually said, yes, it looks like water was in that, not right to the top, but he said it was probably brought in and channeled in occasionally for certain ceremonies or whatever they were using it for, and that's to me that's really intriguing, because that suggests they were like moving water about at the site, and you've got the serpent, you know, where the water level may have been at the lower level of that particular kind of pit, which, you know, as references to water and so forth. So what do you make of that? Do you think they were utilizing water?
Well, I think that the water is definitely an element that may have been part of this, or certainly the use of liquid. As Nesmith Carroll says in his paper, it's very clear that rituals would have begun inside the elliptical enclosure, that this structure was meant for activity to go on, that would have been viewed by people sitting on these stone thrones between the buttresses, on other benches around it. And let's say there's an aspirant or an initiate in there, and they undergo certain processes to get into an altered state. And in that altered state, they have to then enter into the pillar shrine. And remember, the only way that you can get into it is within a circular hole that's 70 centimeters in diameter. And once you're inside that, you are confronted by this weird carved head, which I think is a human-headed snake. You have lots of snake imagery around. If you go into the next enclosure, the pit shrine, as I call it, you've got a massive snake all the way around the wall. You've got this snake channel that you mentioned, which possibly would have carried water or liquid. That's unquestionably serpentine. The three structures themselves are all in a snaking line, and all of the process suggests serpentine activity. And I think this is incredibly important because we have to look at things from a highly symbolic, shamanistic point of view. And what they would have achieved, what they were trying to achieve when they were entering into an altered state. And we certainly know, for instance, from Gobekli Tepe, from Çatalhöyük, places like that, that one of the main totemic symbols, of course, was the vulture. And if that's correct, then vulture shamanism would have been involved with it, something I've written about since From the Ashes of Angels back in 1996. And you'd have had shamans who would have adorned themselves in garbs of feather coats and stuff like that, probably worn the claws, talons of birds and whatever, to actually get into a state where they would believe that they could enter into the flight of that particular bird. We know that the bird's also connected with excarnation and death rituals and whatever, but let's not go into that. But at Carahan, it's very clearly the snake that's important. So are we therefore to assume there's a possibility that the initiates would adopt some kind of snake-like actions? And obviously the way that they would get into the pillar shrine from the elliptical shrine would actually almost necessitate you crawling into it like a snake. But what are these tiny little holes? Well, very clearly, they're what we call soul holes or Seelenloch. You have them at Gobekli Tepe in enclosures D, enclosures C, enclosure B, enclosure H, all in exactly the same place in either the north-northwest or northwest portion of the enclosure. So where is it? In connection with the elliptical enclosure at Carahan in the north-northwest. It's exactly the same position. I mean, all right, the angles slightly vary, but it's in exactly the same place. And it's very clear that what a soul hole does is allow you to get into not just an altered state of consciousness, but into a state of death. Because remember, I mean, these people wouldn't just be playing around when they went into altered states. They would believe there was a good chance that when they went into a death state, they would never come back, that they were in the state of death that a person, when they lost their life, would be in. It would be exactly the same. So it'd be the same journey. So by the time that you got into the pillar shrine, you would be in that type of death state. So whatever was going on is going to be otherworldly in nature, it's going to be liminal in nature, and you're trying to achieve something. Almost certainly otherworldly knowledge and wisdom that's going to be associated with the symbol of the snake.
So is the alignment from domain enclosure, does it kind of go through the hole, the soul hole, towards the other hills where the
absolutely. It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect.
Okay.
And whether you accept the alignment to Cygnus or not, there's no question that there seems to be a relationship between this alignment and the pillar shrine and Gobekli Tepe. Gobekli Tepe plays a big role in that. But one thing I'll say before we forget is that reading Carol's paper, clearly he's right. He's a Turkish man who's writing in English, so sometimes it's a little bit of a struggle to know exactly what he's saying. But what he appears to be implying is that it's not just Karahan Tepe that they're discovering the T-pillars, but that there is a valley on the eastern side of it, which I know you and I have walked, and it's full of debris of pre-pottery Neolithic age. But what he's suggesting, from what I can read, is that the hill on the eastern side also has T-pillars sticking out of the ground. He says 2 hills. That means 2 hills, and he's not talking about Gobekli Tepe. He seems to be talking about what he calls the eastern terrace of another hill, which can only be the one to the east of Carahan itself. Now, if that's the case, this complex is extraordinarily large. It's going to dwarf Gobekli Tepe. Everything that's coming out is suggesting that this is bigger than Gobekli Tepe. Having said that, I think what's important also to point out is that it's later than Gobekli Tepe. You'll see people banding around, various dates to do with this. Everything from, 12,000 years ago down to about 8,000 BC or whatever. What Carol says specifically in his paper is that this complex so far, what they've uncovered is late pre-pottery Neolithic A into early pre-pottery Neolithic B. What that means, essentially, is from about 9,100 BC down to about 8,500 BC. But it doesn't end there, and I'll tell you for why. Because twice he mentions that in the infill of the enclosures, in fact, structures AB, the pillar shrine, and structure AA, the pit shrine, some fragments of pottery. That's interesting because that brings us into what's known as the ceramic Neolithic period, which doesn't kick in until, there's various, but essentially about 6,500 to 7,000 BC. If that's the case, that suggests it didn't shut down properly until that time. So it could have continued on in one form or another through till that period. That does make some kind of sense to me, particularly as some of the T-pillars there are just so simple that they are basically just like little standing stones. And they resemble very closely the standing stones, menhirs, whatever you want, at another site that's north of Diyarbakir called Chayunu. And those pillars there are also plain and without the actual T-shaped termination. And there's another link with Chayunu because the way that the central pillars have fallen in the elliptical enclosure at Carahan suggests that they are not side on like the ones at Gobekli Tepe, but like that, they face towards you. as you enter inside it. And the only other place that we've got that I know of, and I mean, obviously there are about another dozen small sites being uncovered, of which, we only have sketchy information about what's been discovered. The only other place is China itself, where the pillars will actually, as you look towards them, are face on as opposed to like edge on. That's like to say face on as opposed to edge on. So there is a difference. And I think what's going on at Carahan is something that I've already written in the articles that I've done about it, even before these excavations began, is that this is a schism. This is a breakaway from Gobekli Tepe. At some point, the people who were at Gobekli Tepe have, the core have said, look, it's beginning to go nowhere. I think that we're beginning to lose our way somewhere. Let's start afresh somewhere else. So they go another 30 miles to the east into the Tek Mountains and set up at Karahan Tepe. Now, I'm not saying there was nothing going on at Karahan Tepe before these people turned up. There could easily have been. For instance, Bahattin Chelek, in one of the papers that he did on Carahan, talks about the discovery of lower Paleolithic tools at the site. But that doesn't really mean a lot, because all that suggests is that they could be what's known as heirlooms. And that's items that have been brought to the site, possibly as offerings, or maybe even to be used to make new tools. So that doesn't really mean that the site was occupied during lower Paleolithic times, or even in the middle Paleolithic, or even the later Paleolithic. We don't know that. But, I mean, look, anywhere can be occupied at any point. But it would seem as if what was going on, what we see here, the construction of these monuments probably began around 9000 BC. I mean, I'm happy to change what my statements to do with this as new information comes out, of course, because we do need dating evidence based on carbon-14 evidence and whatever else they can use to give us some dating.
Okay, I've got a question. There's one thing about that site that kind of got me compared to Gobekli Tepe. You mentioned it previously, just for a moment, that they were kind of layering over the top, small layers.
Yeah.
When you look at all the photos and the footage of the site now, it looks like much of it's still damaged. I mean, do you think it was deliberately covered over, like Gobekli Tepe, being repaired, covered over very carefully?
Yeah, this is the main thrust of Carroll's recent paper. He's saying that it is such deliberate that they've created deliberate layers. He's talking about different coloured soils, even. Red soils, yellow soils, and I mean, where these soils come from, whether they come from outside the area or they just look pretty or they were there for effect, I don't know. But it seems not just to be deliberate burial, but with reverence to the experience of what's taken place there, and with reverence to the spirit of the place, the genius loci, who quite clearly had done its job, and they were obviously just trying to put it back to sleep, essentially. And I mean, you often hear people talk about Gobekli Tepe and say, oh, it was deliberately covered over at the last minute because there was something happening, some cataclysm or something on the way. It doesn't seem to have been the case, because it would seem that a enclosure, a special building, as they're being called at Carahan, have a function for a certain period of time. Now, this could be astronomical. And then once that function has run its course, it will be reverently buried, decommissioned, buried, and put to sleep. And that means that was probably done, with different enclosures done at different times. But it does seem as if these three subterranean or deep enclosures that have been uncovered so far, that are all interlinked, were all decommissioned and buried roughly around the same time.
When we were there in 2018 and in previous visits since 2014 or so, there's what we noticed as well is going up the hill, the tops of these pillars sticking out the ground were like, they appear to be in lines or avenues, all going to the same point. And it doesn't appear much of that has been excavated yet. So what are you expecting to see once that gets uncovered?
Well, I mean, firstly, obviously, any assessments that we made in the past are based on purely what we could see. But what we could see is that they did seem to be winding their way up to the top of the hill, and in particular, the so-called northern knoll, as we call it. In other words, this is this place that you can stand on the northern part of it, which makes you look out towards the north, towards Gobekli Tepe. Now, if you turn around at this point, the hill rises up and you can't see towards the south. So, you know, there's no way that you can say that these monuments that are being uncovered are facing the south and something's going on there. They're clearly facing towards the north, and they're facing towards the east, if you want. That's the only other area that you would be able to see. But what I'm doing at the moment, and I'm just about to put up a brand new video, which I hope you're all going to watch, and Hugh will put the link up before he finishes editing this, is that what appears to be going on is that these three enclosures, the elliptical enclosure, the pillar shrine, and the pit shrine, are themselves winding their way around this northern part of the hill, so that the third one is aligned towards the northwest, or in fact, the west-northwest. And what I've just determined, this only in the past few hours, is that it's actually aligned perfectly onto the sunset at midsummer, perfectly. And that brings with it some very, very interesting observations, because just a couple of hours after that, the Milky Way would stick vertically out of exactly the same azimuth from the position, obviously, where the sun's just gone, you know, the ecliptic point, up into the sky, perfectly vertical at exactly the same azimuth. To me, that is not coincidence. What I mean by that is that the alignment of this site cannot be coincidence. So, in other words, you're dealing with alignments of specific shrines, that one of them's towards Gobekli, but then you move round to the next one, and that's facing towards the sunset at the time of midsummer around 9000 BC. So, you know, there's a sophistication here that is enormous. The construction of these pillars, the pillar shrine with these, you know, these almost phallic-like standing stones cut out of the bedrock, and everything that's going on there, this experience, the experiential nature of it, suggests that we're dealing with a culture that had knowledge of what to do and what they wanted to achieve going back many thousands of years. And this is even more so, I would say, than Gobekli Tepe. And you have to then ask yourself, where has this knowledge come from? And it's already thousands of years old. And obviously in my books, what I suggest is that some of the main influences coming into Gobekli Tepe have come in from the north, via the Caucasus, via the Russian steppe, probably from as far east as the Ural Mountains and even Siberian Mongolia, if you take it as far back, with things like the Shigia idol, that's about 11,500 years old, this carved wooden idol that has similarities in its appearance to what's going on at Gobekli Tepe, that's found in the Ural Mountains. But I think that obviously Carahan is slightly later, so it's a product of the Gobekli Tepe culture. So it's not a product of anybody coming in from the north. This is a product of what's going on in Anatolia at that time. But what I would say, and I think is very strongly going to be the case, is that there is a connection between Carahan and Egypt and the Levant. I mean, in my book, The Cygnus Key in 2018, I spent dozens of chapters, well, not dozens, but it seemed like it when I was writing it, of chapters on the relationship between Anatolia in the pre-pottery Neolithic age and Egypt in particular, a site called Helwan. Helwan is the stepping stone from the Levant into Egypt. Almost certainly it had a pre-pottery Neolithic culture that evolved into a ceramic Neolithic culture and then into a late Neolithic culture that eventually became pre-dynastic in nature and was the foundations behind the Pyramid Age of Egypt. That's what I write in the Cygnus Key. And I think that what we're seeing at Carahan is more evidence of the ability of the ancients to be able to cut blocks, to cut into bedrock in a way which we see developing in Egypt at a slightly later time. And I wouldn't mind betting that there were structures like Karahan Tepe in Egypt, perhaps at Giza, perhaps somewhere similar, perhaps at Helwan or both. And unfortunately, due to time, they've just been lost, beneath the modern cities, beneath monuments as far back as the Pyramid Age. And obviously the debate over how old the Sphinx is goes on. But I wouldn't mind betting that you will find eventually evidence of a pre-pottery Neolithic culture in Egypt that is creating similar constructions to what you see at Karahan Tepe.
Also, one of the things that caught my attention at Carahan, obviously at Gobekli and the other sites they're uncovering now, is the 3D relief carvings, beautifully done, very abstract, very strange styles. And they're on very high pillars, especially at Gobekli, possibly at Carahan as well. I mean, the unfinished monolith there is huge, like 18 feet tall or so. So I always get the sense that they were playing with shadows, not just of where the shadows were falling from, the pillars onto the ground and so forth, but actually the actually images, the carvings would emerge certain times of the year, like a sort of solar kind of story unfolding. And I always think that's the case because everything's out in the open. There's, you're going to see this, but then they'll bury it as well for some reason. And what do you make of that? I mean, do you think they had a kind of annual kind of ceremonial cycle that they were marking out?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I can't speak about individual, carvings unless they're in context and in situ. But what I will say is, if you look at the three subterranean structures that we've been talking about at Carahan, you got the ellipse, which is very clearly on the eastern side of Carahan. Then you have the pillar shrine that's gradually edging its way to the north. And then you have the pit shrine, which can now see the sunset at the time of the summer solstice. Now, that to me suggests that you're not meant to see that sunset if you are in the elliptical enclosure. It's been deliberately placed. Because if you were meant to see it and you were meant to celebrate it, why not put the whole thing around the other side of the hill where you could clearly see the horizon? And I mean, this is something that you find, for instance, in later Neolithic tradition at places like Avebury, for instance, and Silbury Hill, how the stones can be only seen from certain directions. Silbury Hill can only be seen from certain places, in the henge, whatever. This is part of their mindset of the placement within the landscape was very, very important. They're not just randomly chucking stuff up, where they want to. There is a ritual process involved of steps heading towards some kind of readiness for something. And I think that readiness is to do with a particular celestial event in association with the horizon, most obviously, like the sunset at the time of midsummer. And, beyond that, it's like, well, what's all this serpent got to do with any of it? Why choose the serpent? What is it? Just another totem symbol? Is it the symbol of a particular tribe or clan? Well, maybe, but I think it's far more than that. I mean, as we know, the serpent or snake is a primary symbol of cosmic awareness, of knowledge, of wisdom, And I think that's what's being inferred at Carahan, particularly. I mean, at Gobekli Tepe, it's all over the place. It curls around stones and things like that. It may have a slightly different function there. But at Carahan, it's being singled out. And this is something that we noticed years ago, I wrote about, that, I mean, at least 3 standing stones, from what I know, all have as their primary symbol snakes. I mean, I was at the farm at Carahan years ago, and I remember the people there saying that Bahatin Chelek had actually found a new stone with a snake on it that had 3 heads. Now, whether they just were wrong or whether they've hidden this away or whether it's going to be revealed or what, I don't know. But if that's the case, that would actually be really, really interesting. I could make something of that, but until it's revealed to the public, we can't say any more. But what it is all telling us is that snakes are important, and snakes also, remember, are connected with Gobekli Tepe, because before we went digging around in the caves and holes there, the people at the farm said, "Oh, be careful up there. It's notorious for snakes." So, of course, that put us on guard, and we went up there and investigated this beehive structure that's beyond this small circular hole, which I ended up calling the snake pit. And it looked like a snake pit. It looked like it was something out of Indiana Jones. And, as Hugh will recall, we went up there in full gear. And I got down inside this beehive cave, and I can report that there was no snakes down. There were loads of bones, but there was no snakes. I studied the walls and whatever. Now, okay, you could say, well, these people may have just seen a couple of snakes up there and just were warning you. And that may be the case, but it might also be a sort of what we call site perpetuation. In other words, something that's been said about that hill for a very, very long time. And, be careful, that place is connected with snakes. And this is something that will be carried forward across millennia, and can be retained, through to the modern age. And I think that's something that should definitely be taken into consideration. But there is absolutely no question that the key symbol of Karahan Tepe is the snake, period.
So also, Andrew, so with all the discoveries that are being made, just not just at Carahan and Gobekli, but there's like this Tepela kind of project with these multiple sites across the whole area, stretches like, huge distance. They've just started excavating some of the sites. And I remember when we were talking a while back, when we first heard about this, a couple of months ago, I think it was now, there was this idea that, are these sites connected? Do you think they're geodetically placed? Have you got any, is there any connections? Was there kind of routes between them, ceremonial routes and things like this, pathways? Or do you feel it's more random? Or is there not enough information to discuss that yet?
Well, I think it's the last of what you said, really. There's not enough information. The only thing I can say is that Bahatin Chelek, in some of the reports that he did on some of these lesser known pre-pottery Neolithic sites, did say that at least 3 in one instance were in a north-south line. And I mean, that could be coincidental, it could be simply making use of the lay of the land, but it could be indicative of ritual landscapes whereby you are aligning yourself with particular stars or celestial events. I think that is very possible. Plus, we have to factor into all of this the much later cult centres that emerge in this region that are associated with the Sabians, such as Sogmatar, which is just down the road from Carahan, ultimately. I mean, it's only drive-wise, it's only about 20 minutes. And that's an extraordinary place. I mean, it's known as the place of the 7 temples of the Sabians. And I mean, I saw Neolithic tools there scattered about. So I would think there's every chance that there was another Neolithic settlement there. And then, of course, we got Haran itself, another Sabian centre. I mean, the Sabians were there obviously only a couple of thousand years ago and down to medieval times, but they replaced much earlier cultures that had lived on the spot, going all the way back to around 8,000 BC. The earliest hill or tepe, occupational mound in the area of Haran, is Tel Idris, which is about 5K to the southeast of Haran, very close to the border with Syria. And, interesting that it's the whole Idris connection, which is the Arabic name for Enoch, of course. And that's another whole thing that we could get onto. And that's that if you had what is quite clearly now, in my opinion, not just high culture there, but the rudiments of a civilization, a civilization based around this type of construction and their relationship to place and to the stars, a shamanic civilization, as I've referred to it on various occasions. But this is getting bigger and bigger. And the memory of this is going to be there across thousands of years. This is not going to be forgotten about, even if every site is covered up. And of course, it was as far back as 1996 that I said, look in this area for evidence of a lost civilization that gave us the rudiments of civilization, agriculture, animal husbandry, metallurgy, wine, beer, structured houses, and that are remembered in myth and legend as the watchers and Nephilim of Jewish tradition, Book of Enoch, and of course the Anunnaki of Sumerian tradition. I mean, it was Klaus Schmidt himself in his book on Gobekli Tepe that suggested that the Anunnaki were the founders of Gobekli Tepe. I mean, he says that. I mean, I've said that separately, but if a man like that says it, you've got to sit up and take it seriously.
I think that connection is surprisingly strong, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned the Enoch kind of connection with Idris and everything. I mean, both you and I have both been to Cadi Idris in Wales, the seat, the great seat of Idris, who was the giant ruler, the holy astronomer of Britain, and even in Muslim tradition, he's like the founder of geomancy. He's connected, potentially with the layout of sites and surveying and things like this. So it's crazy that you've got this connection. I mean, could the stories then, of Enoch, of this biblical tradition of the Watchers, the Anunnaki, go that far back? Do you think it's really that old?
Definitely. Yeah, I've no doubt about this at all. I mean, Enoch himself is simply a vehicle, a literary vehicle, pulling this information from the past to the present. The early parts of the Book of Enoch were known as the Book of Noah. Obviously, name checking Noah, the survivor of the flood in the Hebrew Bible. And of course, it's only about another 100, 150 miles to the east of Karahan Tepe that you've got the most obvious site for the setting down of the ark. I mean, if you want to believe this stuff, which is Jebel Judi or Mount Judi. And that's the authentic place. And that goes back certainly to Assyrian times, as far as, connected with the survivors of the flood. So, you've got in this area, plus we should remember that Sanliurfa, the ancient city of Urfa or Edessa, very close to Gobekli Tepe and about 30 miles to the west of Carahan, used to be known as Adamna. Adamna means the place of Adam. Now, where do these names come from? I mean, we know also that Sanliurfa is connected with the traditions of Abraham. Abraham is supposed to have been born there. And what we find is that all of the earliest stories in the book of Genesis, up to and including that of the story of Abraham, we remember, then leaves Haran and then goes to the promised land of Canaan. And sets up there in the Levant around a place called Mount Gerizim or Shechem. That everything happens in southeast Anatolia or Eastern Anatolia. That was the place of the Bible. That's the original Garden of Eden, as I tried to say as far back as from the Ashes of Angels. The Garden of Eden now corresponds exactly where the civilization of the ancients is today. There's no question about that.
So what do you expect that's going to come out of this area? You've foreseen quite a lot of this clearly, because when from the Ashes of Angels, for instance, you were saying this is the spot, and eventually it kind of emerged as you were writing the book, I believe.
Well, that's right. I mean,
is there more to come? Do you think there's going to be more major revelations? I mean, just what's coming out of Karahan Tepe is surprising, to say the least. I'm quite blown away by their stoneworking, and they're like burying deep into bedrock, proving they were like very sophisticated stonemasons. And obviously the 3D relief carvings at Gobekli and other places, it's like, hang on a sec, where did this come from? This is just such a beautiful, sophisticated, abstract stoneworking technique. It's amazing.
Well, I mean, we're dealing, I think, with a shamanic civilization. And when I say shamanic, I mean ones that they weren't building cities in the same way that you might expect anybody with a civilization to do. But they had a knowledge and understanding which was their civilization, that was a civilization mostly of the mind. I've written about this. I know Graham Hancock has written about this as well. And I think that we're talking about knowledge that goes back a minimum of 5,000 to 7,000 years to around 16,000 BC, that sort of period. And arguably it's much older still, and is the amalgam of different ideas and traditions that have come together, mostly, I would say, from the north, as far east as I say, Mongolia, but also quite clearly some ideas coming in from the south, from the Levant, and probably even as far as Egypt and Africa. I mean, obviously, some of our colleagues will point to even further afield, Southeast Asia. I mean, I think that becomes a little bit more tenuous, in all honesty. I think that, we're looking at 2 or 3 major sources that are coming together to create Gobekli Tepe. But then Carahan is almost like the sun, the birth of all this. This is what the product that comes out of Gobekli Tepe. But it's clearly got knowledge in it that's already thousands of years old. And they're trying to do something at Carahan. This isn't a church that people can come to pray. But they're trying to achieve something. They're trying to learn something, trying to connect with something. And to me, the key is that symbol, the serpent. To me, it is the cosmic serpent. And that's what they're trying to make connections with. Whatever you see that cosmic serpent to be is up to the individual. But, to me, this is what they're trying to do.
Wow. Okay. So there's so much coming out of this one site. It's just so strange that we were just walking over that hill a couple of years ago. For several years we've been doing it, just wondering what was there. What were they going to find here? And it is just unbelievable. I'm just absolutely. I mean, and also some of the pieces that are now in the museum in Sanliurfa are pretty interesting. I mean, there's like something with a double head on it. There's these strange kind of anamorph, human kind of mixed with a fox or a different animal, like kind of crawling over its head, and many other pieces. I'm sure more are going to be on display soon. Well, thanks, Andrew. I appreciate your time here. I mean, I know you're working on a video. You're also working on a book as we speak.
Well, yeah, I've got an Egypt book I'm supposed to be doing, but the trouble is that all this Carahan stuff's just filling my head, and until I sort of work it out and work it through, as it were. Then I can't really get back to that. But as I said, I'm going to put up just an hour or so after we've recorded this, a new video, which will be the second video that I'll put out. I mean, it primarily looks into the paper that Neshmi Carroll has done, tries to break down, some of his statements, but then goes off in, new directions at the end of that. So, I mean, it's exciting times. And here's one last thing to think about, is that when Gobekli Tepe came out in the mid-1990s and early 2000s, I think that most archaeologists thought that it was a one-off, it was an anomaly. But what we're now able to say with Carahan and all of these dozen or more other, similar age sites that are coming out with T-pillars, is that this is a huge high culture, if not a civilization. And that, this cannot be ignored. And this must have had a massive impact upon the rise of the Neolithic Revolution. And the reverberations of that would have been felt, as I say, as far away as Europe and as far south as Egypt, and obviously everywhere else in between. So when you have people like Mark Lehner, getting up at conferences when Robert Schoch or somebody, or John Anthony West or Graham Hancock, say, there was high culture in Egypt, 10,500 BC, and Mark Lehner says, prove it, give me the evidence. We now have that evidence. Anatolia is not that far away from Egypt, and there was trading, as I put in the Cygnus Key. There is a paper trail going all the way from Sanliurfa all the way to Helwan and into Egypt itself as early as 9000 BC. So, there is no reason why there should not have been monumental architecture in Egypt, certainly as early as 9000 BC.
Well, I think we've kind of covered quite a lot there. Thanks, Andrew. I appreciate your time. You can catch both Andrew and myself, and Scott Creighton, and Greg Little, Jim Vieira, JJ Ainsworth, all speaking at the online Origins Conference on the 6th of November. Details are below. It's originsconference.co.uk or the Megalithomania website. Andrew's going to have more information. It keeps coming out. The revelations keep emerging. So let's look forward to that. And we're looking at doing a trip, obviously, to Turkey next year at some point. We're starting to look into that. That's a possibility. And a lot more is going to be revealed because some of the sites are just being excavated. So again, thanks for watching Megalithomaniacs. Thank you, Andrew, for your time. And we'll see you next time.